Hello and welcome back, everybody. This is a new interview in my series with autistic women. I'm Tanya, your host, and today I've invited Rose. Hi, Rose.
Hi, Tanya. Lovely to be here.
Thanks for coming, Rose. So, you live in the UK, you're 65, married, and you have two children and a grandchild.
That's right.
Oh, thanks for coming. We'd like to know more about autism and menopause today and also how your overall experience was. So, can you tell us a bit about how you got diagnosed and what your story is?
So, looking back, it was fairly obvious from an early age that there was something very different about me, but it got explained away by other things, like the fact that I was quite a clever child, like reading books. So, the fact that I didn't have many friends, didn't socialize, wasn't seen as that different. But I got into probably my mid-50s and realized that there'd been a recurring pattern whereby I'd overwork, burn out, have to change career track. And I'd also had quite a few interpersonal difficulties with people,
Mm.
both inside and outside work. So, as a former mental health social worker, I knew that this wasn't an obvious mental health issue. It wasn't, I don't like the term, but it wasn't a personality disorder. So I decided that I was getting completely exhausted by this pattern, repeating and repeating. And I just decided I wanted to get to the bottom of what was really going on. So I consulted a psychologist and I had a screening interview, after which she told me that I should most definitely have a full autism assessment. So that's what I did.
Oh, you were lucky that somebody noticed that and saw it, yeah.
Yeah, I had to do all the work myself. I tried to go through my doctor, my general practitioner, and I was told, no, you have a family, you've had a good career. How can you possibly be autistic?
Mhm.
And so I went to a specialist service that works a lot with women and girls and late recognized autistic people, and they had the skills to see beyond the masking. I'd learned communication skills as a social worker and as a police officer. I was quite good at communicating superficially, but under the surface, I'd spend a lot of time preparing for conversations, replaying conversations, worrying about what I said, not being able to fully understand what the other person had said. And I still do those things. But the huge difference is now I know why. And when there's a difficulty with communication, I don't hold myself wholly responsible for that. It's a two-way process.
Yeah, that's very good insight, yeah. So you were in your 50s when you had finally had your diagnosis then?
Yeah, I started the assessment when I was 58, and I got the formal diagnosis a few weeks before my 59th birthday. And I think it was the best birthday present I ever had, to be honest.
Hmm. To have clarity, right?
Yeah, some people have used the word relief to say you feel grief and you feel relief. And that was true for me.
Yeah.
I really regretted some painful things that had happened to me and to other people in my life because, with hindsight, I could see why, that we hadn't understood that I was autistic.
Hmm.
But it felt that from then on, I was going to be able to be a lot kinder to myself, a lot more understanding of some of the challenges that I faced. And I would have strategies and tactics to use. And also, Tanya, to be honest, I would be able to connect with other autistic people.
Yeah.
So if you don't know that you're autistic, you can't find other autistic people to connect with because you don't even know that that's your identity. But that's been a really real positive aspect of this.
Hmm. Yeah, that's very true. Yeah. To know gives you clarity, but also it will change your life. And then you can, as you said, reach out to people and compare your experience, say, oh, that's why, and so on. Yeah. And I think, yeah, it's very beautiful what you said. Mhm.
And I love the concept of aging as a process of becoming.
Yeah.
So a lot of people see aging as a steady decline, a downward trajectory. But for me, I really do feel that I am in the process of becoming who I fully am, which is a quote that we'll talk about later from one of our papers on autism and menopause. So, and part of that becoming for me has been embracing all aspects of my identity. So, I was born as a girl, raised as a girl and a woman, but I had an uneasy relationship with this concept of feminine, female, womanhood. And after my autism diagnosis, um, increasingly I started to identify as non-binary, meaning that I don't really identify with a specific gender. I
Mhm.
can't, I'm kind of fluid.
Mhm.
I've never been particularly interested in stereotypical female kind of activities. So it's been very liberating for me that now, there's the option of using the pronouns they, them, and saying, I was raised as a girl, brought up as a woman, but now I identify as being something different to that.
Mhm. Yeah. Does that change your relationship to your husband?
Well, well, funnily enough, I mean, he's not a stereotypical man.
Mm.
So he's a very, his feminine side is very well developed. And so I think, as a pair of people,
Mhm.
like our relationship, like gender's not really a massive component of that somehow. We're just individual people who happen to get on. But the hard thing is, so I told my children about this gender thing, and they're fine because they're kind of in their 30s and like, hey, yeah, whatever. I haven't even attempted to tell my parents who, my mum's in her late 80s, my dad's 91. I couldn't even begin to try and explain it to my parents because I think they've had enough to cope with with me being autistic. And I think they were confused about why I felt the need to get diagnosed. It's like my mum's was like, why did you do that? So if I were to now tell them, oh, by the way, I also don't really identify as a woman, I think that would be a very difficult concept for them to understand. So I haven't even gone there. And there are some situations where I just don't bother saying anything, like with my GP.
Yeah.
It's always so rushed. We're always dealing with a specific health issue. I've never had the time or space to say, by the way.
Mhm. Yeah.
However, yesterday, this was a good example of good practice. Yesterday, I was assessed by an occupational therapist for adaptations to my house because I have arthritis. And she noted in the conversation that I said, I don't strongly identify as being a woman. I am non-binary. And she rang me this morning and said, oh, could I check what pronouns you'd like me to use in your report? And I thought, how refreshing, like
Very good.
we're getting to a position where it's becoming more normalized not to make assumptions about people's
Yeah.
gender and pronouns. So yeah.
That's good. Yeah. So if we look at the way you live in everyday situations, how do you think is the autism um, eh, changing your experience or limiting your experience? What problems do you face every day?
Well, I kind of thought of three main ones, really. I mean, the first is common to a lot of autistic people, and that's sensory sensitivities. So for me, it's visual, auditory, smell,
Mhm.
taste, textures, touch, all of these things. However, they are often huge barriers and huge challenges and can make me very dysregulated and overwhelmed. But also that real sensitivity is completely joyful, so I get massive satisfaction out of touch, taste, texture, visual things, auditory things. But it depends on whether I'm in control control of what I'm being exposed to. So touch for me can be amazing, but it can also be terrible. So if a random person starts touching me, it's awful. But touch in the right context is amazing. And I think because I experience it more intensely,
Yeah.
it's
Mhm.
both, it's a double-edged sword. So it can be good and it can be bad. So that's one of them.
Mhm.
And then the next thing is around communication. So this has been a long-standing issue, and I don't think it's any coincidence that I went into jobs which involved studying communication, practicing communication. I even taught communication skills to social work students. So that's so interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah,
But
yeah.
it's a bit like if you're not, if English isn't your first language, you probably know the grammar better than somebody who just grew up speaking English, because you had no, like if you grow up speaking English, you have no need to learn the grammar and the rules. But so I learned communication through rules and patterns and observation and planning and preparedness. I can't communicate in a very natural, free way when I'm communicating with non-autistic people, because then we get into difficult territory.
Yeah, we
So
scripting, right?
yeah. So I plan and prepare. And
Mm.
like when I used to go to parties, I mean, I don't really like social parties, but I would take props in my bag, objects I could produce and show people. And, I needed support. And I spent, in my childhood, in lots of situations, I was non-speaking. And if I get very distressed now, if I'm on the point of meltdown or in meltdown, I either become non-speaking or I go into echolalia, where I just keep repeating the same thing over and over again. Or the worst one is sometimes in a meltdown, I will lose control over what I'm saying. And it's like I've taken a truth drug, and I will tell the person I'm with the most terrible thing. And even while I'm doing it, I can think, stop, 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 but it just comes out.
Mhm.
And that can be very, very damaging to relationships. So it's hard, isn't it? Sometimes it's like a tap. Either I'm completely silent or I'm very talkative,
Yeah.
but I have trouble regulating.
Yeah, it's challenging. Yeah.
Yeah. And
Mhm.
yeah, now my third one is an interesting one. My third one is I have a real intolerance of unfairness, injustice, and unkindness. So it doesn't have to be directed towards me. It could be directed towards a stranger, somebody I've never met. But if I'm in the presence of somebody who is disrespectful or derogatory about another person, or if somebody emails me and makes an unpleasant comment about a third party, I get extremely, extremely distressed. And I find that really, really hard to deal with. And so if I'm in a toxic situation in a workplace where there's a lot of that kind of thing going on, I won't survive very long. I really just, I can't tolerate it. And then what happens is I get upset about it. I speak up about it, and then everything goes terribly, because then, if it's a colleague being bullied, which I've had in the past, a black colleague being bullied in a racist way, and I intervened and said, called it out for what it was and said that, I objected to this and it was racist language and behavior. And then of course I became the target for the bully. But that was okay in my view, because I think another thing about some of us is that we're not bystanders. So even when I was, very, very shy and mostly non-speaking as a child, if there was a situation where I needed to step up, I did.
Oh, wow. And you took, you defended the person even when you were non-speaking.
Yeah, I mean, I was only ever non-speaking in certain situations. I would speak at home with my immediate family, but in school and at university, I hardly spoke except if I was with a small group of people I knew. So ironically, when our results went up at the university, I did well. I got a first class honours degree.
Mhm.
And somebody said, "Who's that? Who's that? Who's that person who got the first?" And I heard somebody say, "Oh, that's the one who just smiles a lot and never says anything." That was me. So the smile became a mask. The smile became a way of, I'm no threat to you. I mean no harm. The constant smile,
Yeah,
but very few words.
yeah. Yeah, and if you don't talk in the neurotypical world, you're not seen. That goes with relationships or at work specifically. I notice that if you don't talk, if you don't present who you do, who you are, what you do, and what you have accomplished, you will all be overlooked for promotion. Yeah, it's like you don't exist. Yeah. Mm.
Yeah. It's tough, isn't it? Because
Yeah.
because I'd much rather just get on with work rather than spend all the time saying, "Oh, look at me, look what
Yeah, yeah,
wonderful work
yeah.
I've done." Do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
But
yeah, yeah.
it's sort of it's this whole expectation of self-promotion,
Yeah,
and I do best in jobs which involve just quietly getting on with things.
yeah, I know. Yeah, it's hard for us to understand it. Yeah, but I have come to a point where I can understand that neurotypicals are like that, and to yeah, to be understanding about it, and also to try to talk sometimes, not to always be quiet. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's I've always found it quite easy to talk if I had something to say, but in some situations you're expected to talk even if you don't have anything to say, just to talk, and that's the tricky bit.
Yeah, we can't do that. It's like injustice. We it doesn't make sense. Yeah.
Now,
Okay. Yeah. Do you think that's was it for all the limitations you experience in everyday life, more or less?
well, it's always hard to say. I mean, I think fatigue is huge, but I think fatigue relates to the extent to which I'm having to consciously manage my facial expression, what I'm thinking, what I'm saying, my environment, coping with unpredictability and change, So classic sort of features of autism, finding sudden unexpected change difficult. But at previous points in my career, like as a police officer, I embraced that. I mean, I never knew what was going to happen when I went out on shift as a police officer. But in a way, what made that possible was that I had a really strong foundation of policies and procedures and
Yeah.
things, that I had to follow. So if I have that core of certainty, then I can cope with chaos. The same with mental health social work. At the core, there were various laws, policies, procedures, ways of working. So it made the sort of chaotic element possible. But I think as I've got older, I've become less, I have less energy for that kind of thing. And I'm definitely veering towards jobs that have less drama and less
Yeah.
unpredictability and less distress, because I think the other big myth about autism is that we're not empathetic people. And I actually experience hyper empathy. So when I was in mental health or police or probation or prison work, I felt other people's distress and pain and acutely. So it's very emotionally exhausting to feel so connected with other people's suffering.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, sure.
you have to work hard to maintain your well-being.
Of course. Yeah. 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 We need a lot more energy to cope with the day-to-day life. Yeah. Um. And what strategies did you come up with to, for example, with the fatigue, what are your strategies to make it through the day?
Well, part of it is planning. So looking at how demanding different activities and events are going to be and trying to factor in time beforehand to actually build up a reserve of energy and
Mm-hmm.
then time off afterwards to decompress. So, if I'm going away to do something that month, I'll try not to do anything else that's very demanding because that's going to use up all my energy and it'll probably take me 2 or 3 weeks to recover. And before I knew I was autistic, I just used to think that I needed to push myself harder,
Yeah.
keep up with other people. So the benefit of knowing is that I now know that I have specific requirements.
Mm.
If I travel, I'll try and plan a journey so it's not overstimulating, off-peak travel,
Yeah.
go at a quiet time, accommodation. Everything has to be considered. Because if not, I can very, very easily get overstimulated, exhausted, overwhelmed, burnt out. And I think each time you go around that cycle, like I'm never sure I fully recover from each big episode of burnout. So I want to avoid burnout at all costs, really, because I think it can take a long, long time to recover. And I'm never entirely sure that I fully recover from it. Each time I feel it's pulling me down.
Oh, wow. Why do you think it is like that?
Um, well, I suppose it could have to do with trauma, that burnout often for me happens in conjunction with trauma, getting triggered with things that have happened previously. And, and so I had psychotherapy for 18 months after my autism diagnosis with an autistic therapist, and that was really, really good.
Oh, wow.
But really what came out of that was the need to protect myself and not to stay in situations or relationships that are damaging to me. I think before I would hang on thinking, out of conscientiousness, a feeling of duty. Now, if I experience distress, then I need to cut that off, because it's going to damage me. So, as far as possible, limiting exposure to toxicity, yeah, is
Mm.
what is my main strategy, and making lots and lots of space for rest, recovery,
Yeah.
preparation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, very good. Yeah. I think that's, yeah, the best strategies, time and the recovery. And I think also we learn as we get older, we learn when it's enough or what we can cope with and what not during the day when we plan. It's like, okay, I can do that much socializing or not. Yeah, that's very good input. Thank you, Rose. By the
But you
way,
know what? Yeah.
yeah,
Sorry, I
no
interrupted
problem.
you. I was just going to say, don't you think, though, that it links with privilege? Because I now have the privilege of not working full time.
Mm.
Whereas earlier in my life, had I discovered that I was autistic then, for financial reasons, I might not have been able to work less than full time. And what I would love to see for not just neurodivergent people, but for everybody really, wouldn't it be fantastic if we had a universal basic income to give everybody a baseline of income, and then on top of which people can work and volunteer and do education and other things? Because I think, like, one of the biggest problems for society is that people overwork, the demands on them are too great.
Yes.
And as we evolve and as AI takes hold and there are fewer people in actual jobs, we're going to have to rethink the whole role that work plays in our lives.
Mm.
And sometimes work, I mean, I would regard myself as a recovering workaholic because I was definitely addicted to the praise element of doing work and getting praise for the work and wanting to do more work. And
Mm.
I think it's really, really hard because unlike other addictions, being addicted to work is not seen as a negative thing. It's
Yeah.
often seen as a really positive thing. So it's a tough one.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah. Well, yeah, privilege. Yeah, I think you're right. I can only talk of myself, of course. I have the privilege to work only half of the year, but this is a design, it's not a privilege. I design, I do. And yeah, but you are right about the universal basic income. It would be good to have a base for everyone. Then you don't need to worry about getting fired. You don't need to worry about, yeah, calling in sick or saying, okay, this is too much. Yeah, I think it's a good way. But I think we're moving that way anyway. It's coming.
Yeah, I think we have to. And there aren't, every time I go into a shop, which isn't very often, I'm shocked because there are fewer people in the shop. There's more and more automatic tills. It's the same everywhere. And, a lot of jobs that we've just assumed are people jobs are going to be AI jobs. So,
Mm,
yeah. And
yeah.
the great thing about if we had universal basic income? It would be less important whether people could or could not get a diagnosis as neurodivergent because at the moment, a lot depends on being able to say, I'm neurodivergent, I need accommodations. But, if we had universal basic income, the pressure would be less. And so it wouldn't matter so much.
Yeah.
Like I probably would have survived in various jobs a lot longer had I
Yeah,
not
that's
had to
true.
work quite so hard.
That's true, yeah. Okay, yeah, we are doing what we can every day and things are changing, I think. So, yeah, by the way, if you're listening now, I give away my best strategies. Now we heard the ones from Rose and I give mine away for free. There's a link below the video that takes you to a free course that you can take and learn. Okay, so now let's move over to the exciting part. You have co-written a few papers about autism and menopause, and I'm really excited to know more about that. Can you eh, tell us a little bit what those papers are about?
Yeah. So this study is called Bridging the Silos, the Autistic Menopause Study, and it's based at Carleton University in Canada. And it also involves colleagues, academic colleagues from Bournemouth University in the UK. And it was a great project because it had three phases. And in the first phase, we interviewed and had focus groups with autistic people who had experience of perimenopause and menopause, and we got them to discuss the challenges, the coping strategies, but also to help us think about what questions we should ask in a survey. So that was our first phase. And our second phase, we decided to go down an unconventional route and invite people who were autistic and again had this experience of the menopause transition to submit poetry, art, any kind of creative work that expressed what they had experienced.
Mm,
And it was really good to do something a little bit different because most academic studies are focus groups, interviews, that kind of thing. So actually using arts-based approaches was really exciting. And then in the final phase, we carried out an international survey, and that had 508 participants, respondents who gave both closed, like tick box answers, but also had the space to write descriptive accounts of their experiences. So they were our three phases. And I'm delighted to say that as of last week, we now have three published papers, and we can provide links to all of those. So the first one is called A Perfect Storm: Autistic Experiences of Menopause and Midlife. So that's the focus group and interview study. And the phrase a perfect storm comes from a quote by one of the participants who said that this was how their life was when being autistic coincided with the menopause transition. Um, so we interviewed 24 people. 13 of them were in Canada and 11 of them were in the UK. So what was really interesting was this built on work that two of my colleagues had done previously. So this wasn't the first exploration, but it kind of built on and further explored the territory. So it confirmed what those earlier studies had suggested, which is that autistic people often seem to experience the menopause symptoms more intensely,
Mm-hmm.
and that they can those symptoms can interact with each other and with the characteristics of being autistic. The other thing was that as autistic people, we often have an awful lot going on in our lives. We're already facing huge demands, just coping
Yeah.
with life generally. So if you know the analogy of the stress bucket, our stress bucket is often full to overflowing anyway. So if you add in menopause symptoms on top of that, it can be the tipping point. And so the other thing was that we know that autistic people often face barriers accessing healthcare, and this was true for our participants. And for many of them, it was deeply traumatic to be dismissed, to be disbelieved, to find it difficult to get the treatment and the support that they needed. Um, and there was a lovely, lovely thing that happened because when the focus groups ran and people came together and talked about their experiences in the focus group for the research, they commented on how amazing it was to be connected with other people with the same experiences
Yeah.
and to feel that they weren't alone. You know, they were no longer strange, different. They were in a group of people who truly understood because they were going through the same things as well. So
Yeah.
that was the first study, and it so it's a small number of people. And there are all kinds of limitations. You know, the people that were interviewed came primarily from England, Ontario, and British Columbia. But it gives us some idea of what's happening and what might be happening for people.
What are the key takeaways of the findings? If you can give us a bullet point list.
Yeah, I think it's that I suppose there are three really that, and it's important to give the caveat that this applies to some autistic people. You know, it may be that autistic people who didn't experience significant difficulties wouldn't bother to get involved in research. But we do take away from this that autistic perimenopause may be more intense and more complex for some autistic people, which means that they're going to need additional information and support.
Mhm.
Um, Also, it's really important that clinicians, health and social care services understand what it is that autistic people are maybe experiencing during perimenopause, but also that a significant proportion of autistic people may not even be diagnosed or recognize themselves as autistic. So,
Mhm.
you know, perimenopause can, certainly was for me, can be the point at which everything starts to collapse and at which
Yeah.
go looking for answers. And I suppose the other thing is that it's the need for support and information and knowledge that is autistic specific and connections with other autistic people if that's what you want. I mean, some of our participants did want to go it alone, but for others, you know, not having those connections, not having that sense of belonging was problematic because then you couldn't have the supportive conversations. You
Mm.
didn't have a peer group who were going through the same experience.
Mm.
So yeah, there's some of the takeaways. Um, this kind of carried on really into the next study, and I'd encourage people to have a look at the creative submissions. It's hard to do them justice without showing them to you, but we had poetry, we had graphic art, and we had some beautiful artworks, and we had a small number of these, so 6 pieces of work, and we kind of thought long and hard, like as researchers, you can't really analyze them like you would analyze interview or focus group data. These are pieces of creative expression. So we decided that myself and the other community research associate, we would respond to these 6 creative works creatively ourselves. So we responded by journaling and writing poetry, using musical references. I made some art, so that there were the original 6 works and then our responses to them. And then we've written up a paper which has illustrations. And I think the interesting thing about this is that allowing people to express themselves in ways other than standard interviews and focus group type interactions and surveys, it kind of opened up a whole additional dimension to people's experiences. It allowed them to express things that they might not have expressed in other ways. And certainly for myself and the other researcher, it was quite magical for us, feeling so deeply connected with the experiences of the participants, because both myself and the other community researcher have been through the menopause transition. So to feel so close to other people having the same experiences was really quite profound.
Mhm. Great.
And I hope to continue that, in future work, to look at ways of allowing people to express themselves,
Mm.
not in a confined, narrow way, but in a more expansive way. And then I can say a little bit about struggling for years, if you like.
Yeah, of
That's the last paper.
course. Yeah.
So that's the big survey. So 508 people
Mhm.
responded to that internationally. And again, we would like it to have been even more international, but we did cover a lot of countries. But even so, most of the responses came from the UK and Canada, which isn't surprising given that's where the research was based. But still, there's a lot more to do about understanding cultural differences around people's experiences. Um, so what came out of that was that autistic people really wanted more appropriate and autistic specific information about menopause, because if you don't know, like for a lot of people, they weren't even aware that they were in perimenopause.
Yeah, yeah.
So, like a lot of people said it made sense with hindsight. They could see what had happened with hindsight, but at the time they may not have been fully aware.
Mhm.
And unfortunately, like clinicians don't always have a good understanding of autism or menopause. So if you put
Yeah,
the two things
rarely.
together, yeah,
Rarely at all, I'd say.
uh, yeah. And then another thing was that sometimes the actual menopause transition was a kind of catalyst for healthier ways of living. So it might be that
Yeah.
people began to become more self-aware. They might be more self-accepting. They might adopt more self-care strategies. They might give fewer Fs about everything. Do you know what I mean?
Mm.
So that it despite all the challenges, it could also be a really positive development. And I think what we concluded was that it's really, really important that there's better awareness of autism and access to autistic specific menopause information,
Mm.
so that autistic people are prepared, informed, ready, and then when they're moving through the transition, things are less of a shock. So it wasn't necessarily that, we don't know enough about how autistic and non-autistic experiences compare. Ours wasn't a comparative study. There are a couple of studies that are comparing autistic and non-autistic experiences to see what the differences and similarities are. But I think that it's generally acknowledged that the menopause can be a challenging transition for anyone if you're already quite stressed, quite overwhelmed, and quite misunderstood,
Mm.
and face barriers accessing services. Then it just creates a whole additional layer of challenge for you.
Mm. Yeah, it's interesting on the things you said. It's exactly my experience, right? Because I was diagnosed at 43 and now I'm 48, and I went through all these hardship that all these people you interviewed mentioned. And yeah, totally agree. We need more autistic related information about menopause. Yeah, good.
And we haven't mentioned ADHD because, of course, some of the people in our study had were both autistic and ADHD, so that can also create additional complexity. And I'm really, really glad that there are now some studies about ADHD and the menopause transition. So, because the challenges associated with ADHD are just as intense, can be just as intense as those associated with being autistic, and some people have both
Sure.
sets of challenges.
Yes.
So it's interesting, isn't it? But I don't know what it's like elsewhere, but here in the UK, the waiting lists are just ridiculously long for assessment. So people are being forced to try and manage things themselves. And again, difficult to get to see a menopause specialist. So
Yeah.
what struck me, some of our participants, they were spending a lot of money that they couldn't afford trying to pay for private treatments that
Yeah.
may have been of dubious benefit, but they were so desperate.
Hmm.
Really, really shocking, I think, that
Yeah.
people are forced into that.
Of course, that was my only solution as well. And I would have died if I hadn't done that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. There was a quote in our paper which somebody was told, oh, well, you're not going to die of menopause. And they actually said, well, actually, I might.
Yeah.
And, I think that for a lot of people, for me, certainly, it has been life-threatening because it can evoke all kinds of difficult feelings of despair and hopelessness. And we already know that suicidality is a particular issue for neurodivergent people, a particular risk. So when we're preparing information to share with clinicians, I think we need them to know about all of these factors and risks so they can factor it all in. I had a terrible experience on a Friday afternoon. So I felt really suicidal on a Friday afternoon and I got emergency appointment with a doctor. And while I was in deep, deep distress, they were packing up their bag ready to go home. And I just remember thinking, I might die because somebody just doesn't see me as worth bothering with.
Yeah.
Just has just, you know, it's a really, really tough thing because we haven't touched on mental health, but what we know is that the mental health of neurodivergent people is often compromised for obvious reasons. We get exposed to a lot of toxic behavior, a lot of stress. So it's hardly surprising that our mental health suffers. But as autistic people, if we try and access a mental health service, what happens? Well, I was an ex-mental health social worker, remember? Guess what happened to me? I went along to my community mental health team. The next thing, they were trying to give me a diagnosis of emotionally unstable personality disorder, which I knew I didn't meet the criteria for. And when I challenged it, they said it was an administrative error. But I just thought this is just a terrible service. It's
Yeah.
dreadful. I'm
Really?
well equipped because, as an ex-social worker, I went straight to the lead psychologist and said, I'm interested in how you've given me this diagnosis. I've never actually been seen by a qualified clinician, only an assistant psychologist. And he was he was deeply embarrassed and started backtracking. But imagine if I was somebody who didn't read my notes, didn't demand to see my care plan,
Mm.
I would have ended up with that label, which
Yeah.
is a label that's used to punish and exclude people, and it's a very sticky label and a very difficult label to get rid of, because if you get upset about having the label, they say, well, there you are. That's an indication that you have this unstable behavior.
Well, it
So
sums up the experience most women in our that age group have, I think. If, even I would say even all women. feel not heard. And then if you narrow it down to autistic individuals, even more not heard, ignored, not seen, like your experience was as well. And we narrow it down even more, autistic beings in menopause time, it's a horrible experience, to say it bluntly. Yeah. And I agree with you totally that we will need to, yeah, something needs to change here with the healthcare providers. They are uneducated and ignorant. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? How so many of us have had that experience. But it's important to say there are some good doctors out there. I've had an
Yeah.
excellent GP recently, sadly, a locum who has now disappeared. But before he disappeared, he diagnosed and treated me with an underactive thyroid, which I might never have discovered had he not been, vigilant. So I think that it's important as well to say in closing that a lot of things can be explained by menopause and autism. However, it's really, really important to check that there are not other co-occurring things going on. So in my case, I think that I thought I was heading for another autistic burnout because I was so fatigued. However, blood tests showed that my thyroid was underactive. So that is treatable. And there was a risk that I might have just thought, oh, well, of course I'm fatigued, I'm autistic. So I think it's really, really important that we have checks, tests, checkups,
Yeah. Like
you
a
have to
whole,
have,
yeah,
yeah,
the idea just popped into my head. Like whenever we get an autism diagnosis, there should be like a whole process of checkups after to see if there's some other things like the thyroid. It's a common one for the thyroid.
yeah,
And yeah, very good.
yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and there's EDS and HEDS, isn't there? The mobility issues with joints. So, I think that and also a lot of gastric issues. So it would be
Yeah.
good, wouldn't it, if our physical health was taken more seriously?
Yeah,
Um,
exactly. Yeah. Yeah, that requires specialization and more education, and hopefully one day we're going to be there, Rose. So
but you know what? Don't you think we've made massive progress? I really feel we have. We are
yeah,
making, you know, even the fact that we're having these interviews and
yeah,
information and research
yeah,
studies.
yeah. Yeah, YouTube is very helpful. I think there's a lot of autistic individuals creating content about it that was not accessible 10 years ago, right? Or more. Yeah. So, yeah, I hope the future is going to be bright. Thank you very much, Rose, for this interview. And um, where can people find you? We can link to your profiles if you want. You can let me know.
Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn, I'm on Blue Sky, I'm on Twitter because I refuse to call it X. Twitter was actually my special interest that I talked about in my autism assessment. And much as it's a really, really dreadful thing now, I still can't bring myself to leave. So I may leave eventually, but for now, I'm on Twitter as Northerly Rose. You'll find me there.
Okay, good. I will link everything in the description below.
Yeah.
Thanks for the interview, Rose. Bye bye.
Bye bye. Thank you.